this story is called The Milkmaid. Now, the year was 1918, and as you may have heard lately, in 1918, the Spanish flu came through and killed many, many people. And if you go to the cemeteries, you can see average size graves, and you can see some short graves as well. So both old and young died from the Spanish flu. And my grandmother and her two sisters and my uncle and my great-grandmother all had the Spanish flu at the same time. And my great-grandfather took care of them. I don't know whether he had it and he got better, or he never got it, or just what. But he was physically taking care of them, and he brought them food and whatever else had to be done. And he could have had help, but I understood that he did it. And in his spare time, there was such a demand for coffins. He had a small sawmill in the back, and he would plane out the lumber, and he would build coffins. And my mama once told me that the scariest sound she had ever heard was the sound of the hammer hitting those coffin nails, because she was not sure whether she was going to need a coffin or not. But anyway, that was between Georgetown and Hemingway up on the hill. And then a little ways down back in Georgetown County near Pee River was my grandfather's people. And they also, they had a big sawmill. And my aunt and one of her brothers ran a small store. And, you know, basically they had some very limited things there, but they did have an ice box there, and they had some milk there, and it was brought in the milk bottles. And one morning, bright and early, real early, my Uncle Benny was sitting in the store, and this woman came in. He had never seen her before. Now, that was a pretty unique situation in our area because he knew everybody knew him, but this woman came in and she did not say a word. She went to the back where the ice box was, and she took a bottle of milk, and she brought it up to the counter, and she set it there and just looked at him with sad, imploring eyes. And she never said a word, but he knew that she needed that milk. And he said, "You need that milk?" She shook her head. "And I'm guessing you don't have any money to pay for it?" She shook her head again. "Well, I tell you what, if y'all are passing through, the next time that you come through here, just pay me for the milk when you come back through." Because, you know, these were hard times, and people were in transit a lot trying to find a better position in the world for themselves. So anyway, he didn't think a whole lot about it because people did that, you know, from time to time. Mostly people in the neighborhood that had a credit tab, and at the end of the year, they would pay him. But anyway, didn't think too much about it, except for the next day, bright and early, the woman appeared again. She came in. She went to the back. She got a bottle of milk. She stood there. He asked her the same questions. You really need that milk?" She shook her head. "And you don't have any money today to pay for it?" She shook her head. "All right, go ahead and take it. You have to pay me later when you come back through." So anyway, the other uncles came in and sat around the pot-bellied stove that day, and they were just spinning yarns and such. And Uncle Benny happened to mention it to the rest of them, that this woman had come and had gotten milk on 2 different mornings and had never said a single word. But she looked desperate, And so they devised a plan that the next day they were going to hide, and they were going to see where she went with it. So they did. They kind of, got in the back of the store and kind of squatted down. And sure enough, same early morning, the same woman dressed all in gray came in. And she went right straight to the ice box and got another bottle of milk and put it there. And he asked her the same two questions. You need that milk? She shook her head. And you don't have any money to pay for it? Well, go ahead and take it. So she started off, and they sat in after her, following her. And so they went down Old PD Road and went on down to Pine Bluff Methodist Church and to the cemetery there, and they were watching, and all of a sudden, she just kind of vanished. So they went to the gentleman that was in charge of who got buried where, and they talked to him, and he said, yeah, there was this wagon that came through the other day. It was a man, a woman, and a little baby. And they had that bad sickness. They looked like their clothes were damp where they'd been sweating, and they looked all clammy, and Lord have mercy, and they were all dead in that wagon. And so I just got some people, and we just put them in a box, the man in one box and the woman and the baby in another box, and we just buried them. And so they thought about this, and they said, we got to find out. And so they got a shovel, a couple of shovels, and they commenced to dig right where he'd said the woman was buried. And they dug and they dug and they dug until they tapped on something wooden, and they opened it up, and there was that same woman dressed all in gray, very obviously dead, and had been dead for several days, but in the crook of her arm was a very, very sick but very much alive baby. And in the foot of the coffin were 3 empty milk bottles. The Boy and the Ghost was turned into a picture book by Robert D. Sansucci, and the illustrator, I can't remember the first name, but Pinckney is the illustrator, and it's a really cool book. But anyway, it goes something like this. There was a boy named Jack who lived in coastal Georgia, and they were so poor. His family were sharecroppers, and that means that you work a lot for a little bit. And so he had 3 younger brothers, and he had 3 older sisters. So he was right smack dab in the middle of the children. Now, the 3 older sisters would follow the mother and father into the cotton field and pick cotton all day. Now, I remember when my daddy had cotton years and years ago, and he actually paid people to pick cotton, and they picked it in big croaker sacks, and then they weighed it at the end of the day to see how much you got paid. Well, they gave me a pillowcase to pick cotton in, and I don't think I ever finished filling up that pillowcase, ever. But I was about 5, so, Anyway, but his sisters worked really hard, and his little brothers stayed around home, and he was the designated babysitter. But they were getting up a little ways, and he told his parents, he said, I feel like I need to do something else to help y'all, and maybe I could go to the city and I could get a job and I could make some money and send it back here for y'all. And they said, oh, no, you're too young. And he kept pleading with him until finally they relented, and they got him a croaker sack and put some belongings in there that would be helpful. His mother gave him a little pot to cook his food in. And she gave him a ham bone. Now, I don't know how much you know about ham bones, but you can cook a ham bone in some water and the ham flavor comes out in it, and you can have some, at least ham broth, and then you can put some other things in it, string beans, collard greens, whatever you want in with that ham bone, or lima beans. No, that's a good meal. Anyway, and she gave him some advice. She said, son, always be kind and always share what you have. And he said, yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am. And his daddy gave him a flint to start fires with, and he gave him a little pocket knife, and he told him to be brave and to always look people in the eye when you're talking to them. So he said, yes, sir, yes, sir. Well, he put all his belongings in the croaker sack and slung it over his shoulder, and then he began to walk down the road, and his family followed him as long as they could, and they waved at him. His mama cried, and his daddy was so proud of him. And anyway, he kept walking, and he noticed that on the side of the road there was some poke salad and some dandelion greens, and he picked those and he put them into his bag. And about lunchtime, he took them out and put them into the pot with the ham bone and some water, and commenced to boiling that up. And by, he had it just about ready, and oh my, it smelled good. And this man came along, and he was even raggedier looking than Jack was. And he said, hey there, boy, you mind if I have some of that soup? He said, no, sir, I don't mind. Help yourself. So the old man had a raggedy tin cup, and he dipped it in there, and he got some out, and he ate it. And the old man asked, well, where are you going, son? He said, well, I'm going to the city to get a job and help my family out, because they're real poor. And the raggedy old man said, well, son, I might know of a way for you to get some money and not even have to go very far. He said, is that so? How would that be? And he said, well, there's a big house up on the hill, and people say it's haunted. And then same people that say it's haunted says that the ghost who lives there will give to whoever can stay the longest and spend the night in that house, the house and all the treasure. And so the boy said, well, can I ask you how come you ain't never tried? 'Cause I'm scared, that's how come. Well, the boy decided that this sounded like a good plan for him. So he walked down the road with the man, and the man showed him this split, this fork in the road. He said, if you go that way yonder, the house is up on a hill, and you just go in and you just spend the night. And if you can make it through the night, then supposedly you will win the house and the treasure that's buried there. He said, okay, I'm gonna try. So he walks and finds the house up on the hill. It's pretty dilapidated at this point in time. There's weeds growing, and there's vines up the side of it. And so he goes in the back door. It's not locked. And he goes in, and there's a fireplace, and there's a pot-bellied stove over here. And he goes out and he gets some pieces of wood, and he starts a fire, and he puts his pot there with the water and the bone and what was left of the greens that he had picked that day. And he started to stir, and anyway, by and by it got to be dark, and he was still stirring that soup because, you know, the longer you cook it, the better it is. And this voice comes down the chimney. Look out below, here comes my feet. And plonk, there in the fireplace was a pair of feet and a pair of brogan shoes. And they sort of clippity-clumped around the room, bumping and thumping. And the voice said, "Ain't you scared, boy?" And Jack said, "No, sir." And he said, "Just don't make me spill my soup." So a little bit of time passes and the voice says, "Look out below, here come my legs." And plonk, there in the fireplace was a pair of legs attached to a behind and a pair of fancy breeches. And they sort of skittered and scootered and jumped on top of those brogan shoes with the feet. And bumped and thumped, and the voice said, "Ain't you scared, boy?" And Jack said, "No, sir, just don't make me spill my soup." Well, time passed, and the voice said, "Look out below, here come my arms." And plonk, there in the fireplace was a pair of arms attached to a chest and a fancy white silk shirt. And it kind of skittered and scootered and jumped up and landed on top of the breeches. Well, the voice came again. "Ain't you scared, boy?" And Jack said, "No, sir, just don't make me spill my soup." Now, about that time, finally the voice said, "Look out below, here comes my head." And plonk, there in the fireplace was a head. It had fiery red hair, great bushy beard, its eyes were glowing, and the rest of the body walked over to the fireplace, reached down, put the head on, screwed it in place, and the ghost looked square at Jack and said, "Ain't you scared, boy?" And he said, "No, sir, you want some soup?" Ghosts don't eat soup. But I tell you what, you have stuck around longer than anybody else. Now I got a proposition for you. You can have this house and all the treasure that's buried in the backyard if you promise me one thing. You see, when I was living, I was mean and hateful to most people. And then I died. And I've been cursed to have to walk around here. And I understand that if I will give money away to the poor and needy folks, that I can go away. And Jack said, "Okay, I can do that." He said, "Now when you head out, you only got to give half of it to the poor and needy. And then you can come back here and live." And he said, "I can do that." And so they went out, and the ghost pointed and showed him where the shovel was. And then under this big tree, he showed him the exact spot to dig. And he started digging and digging and digging and tap, tap, tap. There was a black cast iron pot with a lid. And the gold and silver and jewels and whatever had been buried inside of it. And the ghost held the croaker sack, and Jack poured all the treasure into the croaker sack. And as he was slinging it up over his shoulder, the ghost said, "Thank you, boy." And Jack said, "You're welcome." And before he could get it out of his mouth, the ghost had disappeared. Now Jack took that treasure sack and he started back home. And everywhere he saw poor and needy folks, he gave them some of the money. And he distributed a good half of that money and jewels and what have you. And when he got back home and told his mama and daddy the story, oh, they were so happy. And they gathered up all their children and they moved into that white house up on the hill. And they live there to this very day, or their descendants. And if you don't believe this story is true, you go to that house and you look at it, and there ain't no ghosts nowhere around. This story is called The Golden Tooth. Now, once long ago in Murrells Inlet, there was a young woman named Mary, and she belonged to a fairly prestigious family. They were fairly well off because times were hard back then. Now, she had all the best advantages. She went to a good school, and she had all the clothes that she needed, and all the things that went along with that. And she had her own horse, and she was fond of jumping with the horse. And so one day she jumped, and this was side saddle probably, and she fell off and she broke out her front tooth. Now that was very embarrassing for a young lady at that time because there were no dentists really you couldn't really fix it. But you could get it pulled out if you had the right person. And so they pulled what was left out, and they inserted a golden tooth. So, she was a little bit embarrassed by it, but, it was gold, so, Anyway, she was a young woman around and about the area, and she met this older man, and he was not the one that her parents would have picked for her to go with. And so there was a disagreement, and they told her that they were going to disinherit her if she married him, and didn't make a whole lot of impact on her because she married him. Well, now, much to her chagrin, she found out that he drank way too much. And he, was not a good worker, and so times were hard, and she could not go back and ask her parents for help. Now, time passed, and they had a little daughter, and she was very precious, and so anyway, time passes, and he had an old Model T Ford, and he would drive it around, and it's not a good thing to drink and drive, and so she was in the car with him, and the little girl was in the back seat, and she was expecting her second child. And John did not look where he was going or whatever, and he ran into something, and Mary was hurt really bad. She had a broken leg, and I think maybe 2 broken legs, and but the baby was safe, and they put her to bed, and she waited out the birth of her second child in casts on her legs. So she stayed in the bed, and John was still drinking and was carousing and whatever, and anyway, it came time for Mary to give birth, and the first doctor came in, and he said, John, I'm afraid your wife's going to die. I don't think there's anything I can do. And he left. And then the other doctor came in, and he opened his medical bag, and he took out the medicinal alcohol, and he drank most of it himself to sort of, back himself up with some courage in a bottle. And then anyway, it was a long and difficult delivery, and the baby was born, a little boy, and things were still not going well because Mary was not going to make it, and she did indeed die. Now, John kind of straightened up, and he thought, well, now I've got 2 little children to take care of, and Mary's gone. I got to do better. But, the best intentions lasted for just a little while, and then he started to drink again. And he went through all the money that he had worked for, and he wasn't able to take care of the children, and he was going to take them to her parents, and so they did accept the 2 children, and they took them on, and so now he was just by himself. And he began to drink and drink till he ran out of alcohol. And so he didn't have any more money, and he tried to think what he could do. And he said, you know, Mary told me to make sure that I buried her with that golden tooth because, you know, she was always embarrassed, but that golden tooth is in the grave. So anyway, he went down to the cemetery and he commenced to dig and dig and dig until he uncovered the coffin. And he opened up the coffin, and Mary was in the coffin, and her lips sort of parted, and you could see the shiny gold tooth, and he reached in and he just pulled it out, and then he covered her up and covered everything back up, and then he went home and waited out to the next day. And early that morning he went and bought the biggest bottle of alcohol that you could find. John drank himself into a stupor and passed out in the bed, and the covers were all over him, and he ended up sleeping till about midnight. And at midnight he heard what he thought was Mary's voice, and the voice came, "John, where's my tooth?" And he thought, something's just playing with my head. Maybe it's just the wind. But the voice came a little closer. "John, where's my tooth?" And a little closer, "John, where's my tooth?" Until finally it was in the house with him. "John, where's my tooth?" And then the voice is inside the room with him. "John, where's my tooth?" Well, finally, he screws up every bit of courage that he has, and he pulls the covers down and said, "I ain't got it. I bought that bottle of liquor over there." Ah! Well, now the next morning, somebody found John. He was dead as a wedge. His eyes were open wide, and there was a little trickle of blood down his chin. And his lips were slightly parted, and they looked, and there where his front tooth had been was a hole. Well, you might think that was the end of the story. But, you know, the little girl and the little baby boy, they lived with their grandparents, and every night after they were put into the bedroom, their mother appeared. Sometimes she would place her cheek up next to theirs. Sometimes she'd plant a little kiss on their forehead. Sometimes she would just stand there and smile a sad, sweet smile. And they always could explain that it was her because one of her front teeth was bigger than the other one.